Caiden Voss did not sleep on the night they came to take him away. He had been awake since before dawn, sitting at the edge of his bed with his hands folded between his knees, listening to the sounds of the pack camp settling into the early morning quiet. The mission had gone wrong. 12 wolves were dead, and somewhere in the wreckage of that terrible night, someone had left behind a piece of paper with his name on it. He kept thinking about that paper. He had not written it. He had not seen it. He did not know what it said exactly. He only knew that it existed, that it had been found in enemy territory, and that it carried the impression of his personal seal. When the guards arrived at his door just after sunrise, he was already standing. He did not fight them. He did not argue. He walked out into the pale morning light between two soldiers he had trained himself, and he kept his chin up even when he saw the crowd gathered to watch. Dozens of wolves stood in silence, their faces tight with something between shock and judgment. He walked past all of them. The last person he saw before they took him inside was Celine. She was standing just beyond the edge of the crowd, her arms crossed over her chest, her dark eyes watching him. He looked at her. He waited. In 15 years of fighting for this pack and 3 years of standing beside her as her mate, he had never once asked her for anything he did not deserve. He was not asking now, either. He just looked at her, and she looked back. Then her eyes moved away, slowly, like she was turning a page she had decided not to finish reading. He kept walking. The holding cell beneath pack headquarters was made of old stone and cold air. There was a narrow cot, a single lamp that flickered when the wind moved through the ventilation gaps, and a slot in the door where a guard passed food twice a day without speaking. Caiden spent the first 3 days going over everything he could remember: the mission, the planning sessions, the night before deployment, when Commander Drexler Fane had called him in for a briefing that lasted exactly 10 minutes. He remembered the way Drexler had looked at him across the wide desk, measured and calm, the way the man always looked. And he remembered thinking that the briefing felt short, unnecessary, almost, like it was an excuse to have him in that room for a specific window of time. He turned that thought over in his mind, until it became something solid. His seal had been used to stamp the document found in Ashcroft territory. His seal lived in a locked drawer in his quarters. But his quarters had not been searched until 2 days after the mission, which meant that during those 2 days, anyone with access could have returned it. And during that 10-minute briefing, his quarters had been empty. He had no proof. He had a theory built from memory and timing, and in a room full of witnesses lined up against him, that was worth very little. He knew this. He sat with the knowledge the way you sit with a pain that cannot be fixed, quietly, and without letting it show on your face. On the 6th day, he heard footsteps in the corridor that were different from the guards, lighter, more deliberate. The door slot opened, and then a voice came through it. Caiden. He recognized Lieutenant Bryn Solis before he even got to the door. She was one of his best soldiers. Young, sharp, and completely without the kind of careful political thinking that most pack members developed early. When he reached the door and looked through the slot, she was standing in the corridor in plain clothes. No uniform. No rank badges. They took your rank, he said. I refused to testify against you, she said. They told me that if I would not cooperate, I would be removed from active service. I told them I understood. He stared at her. Bryn, he started. I know it was not you, she said. Her voice was steady and low and completely certain. And I am not the only one who knows it. Just hold on. The Alpha King is sending someone. Hold on until then. A guard appeared at the end of the corridor and told her to leave. She went without arguing, but she held his gaze until the last possible second. He went back to his cot. He sat down. He breathed. He held on. The trial began on the 10th day. The main hall of pack headquarters had been arranged into a formal court. Long benches filled either side. A raised platform stood at the front, where the lead prosecutor waited. And at the very back of the room, in a plain chair with no decoration at all, sat a man that Caiden had never seen in person but recognized immediately. Alpha King, Aldrich Thane, did not look the way stories described kings. He wore no crown. He did not sit in the judge's seat at the front. He sat at the back of the room, still and quiet, with his dark eyes moving slowly across the space like he was reading something written in the air. He was not watching the prosecutor. He was not watching the witnesses as they were called. He was watching Caiden. Caiden met his gaze once, held it for a moment, and then turned to face the front of the room. The witnesses came one after another, 4 junior soldiers that Caiden had personally trained, young men he had pushed through their paces in early morning drills, whose techniques he had corrected and whose failures he had been patient with. They each took their place at the front and described things that Caiden had supposedly said and done. They described a man who was unhappy, restless, and angry at the pack. They described conversations that had never happened and places where Caiden had never been. Their voices shook as they spoke. He noticed that a shaking voice could easily be read as guilt, as the pain of betraying someone you once respected. But Caiden had spent 15 years watching soldiers under pressure. He knew the difference between the shake of guilt and the shake of fear. These 4 young men were afraid, not of what they were doing to him, of what would happen to them if they did not. He sat with that knowledge too. He did not let it show on his face. Then Celine was called. She walked to the front of the room in a dark dress, her posture careful and controlled. She was asked simple questions. Had she noticed changes in her mate's behavior in the months before the mission? Yes. What kind of changes? Arguments about his career, frustration with his superiors, a restlessness she could not explain. None of it was untrue. Every relationship had arguments. Every soldier had difficult days. But the way the questions were arranged and the way the answers were left to sit in the air without any context turned ordinary moments into evidence of something much darker. She did not look at him once. When she was finished and stepped down from the front, a clerk moved through the room and placed a folded document in Caiden's hands. He looked down at it. It was a formal petition for severance of their mate bond. She had filed it that morning with the pack court. He read it once. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in the inside pocket of his shirt, just over his chest. He did not make a sound. That evening, the Alpha King called a recess. 1 full day. No explanation was given. The lead prosecutor looked unsettled in a way he was working hard to hide. Commander Drexler Fane, who had been sitting in a place of honor near the front throughout the trial, spent most of the evening in quiet conversation with pack officials, his expression perfectly controlled, his eyes doing the work his face refused to do. What no one told the pack, what most of them did not discover until much later, was that the Alpha King's 3 personal investigators had been inside the archive vault since the night the king arrived. They were called the Verity. They answered to no one but him, and they had not come to observe the trial. They had come to look at records, communication logs, seal timestamps, deployment paperwork, the access history of every door in PAC headquarters during the 48 hours surrounding the mission. And one other thing, the file records of the intelligence documents found in Ashcroft territory. Every document in the PAC's digital system carried an invisible record of which device had created it, which user account had been active at the time, and exactly when. This information was stored automatically. It could not be changed after the fact. It was simply there, waiting, the way truth tends to wait. The documents had not been created in the communications room. They had been created in Commander Drexler Fane's private office. The user account active at the time belonged to a young aide who had died in the same ambush that started this whole investigation. His account had never been closed after his death. Someone had used his login details, someone who had access to Drexler Fane's office, someone who understood the archive system well enough to know that a dead man's account might go unnoticed. The Verity brought these findings to the Alpha King at midnight. He read the report without expression, asked 3 precise questions, received 3 precise answers, and said simply, "Tomorrow." Tomorrow. The second day of the trial began differently. Before the prosecution could continue, the Alpha King stood from his seat at the back of the room and spoke for the first time since his arrival. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "I am calling a witness," he said. "Lieutenant Bryn Solace." The room stirred. She walked in, still wearing plain clothes, her head up and her hands at her sides. She looked at no one in particular as she took her place at the front. She did not look at Caiden, which he understood. She was keeping herself focused. She was not asked about his character. She was asked one specific thing, what she had seen on the night before the mission, in the corridor outside the war room. She described it without drama. She had been passing through that corridor on her way to the equipment room. She had seen Commander Drexler Fane exit the war room. She had checked the time because she was running behind schedule and was tracking her minutes closely. The time was 40 minutes after the official log showed the briefing with Caiden had ended, and 30 minutes before Drexler's next log entry showed him leaving the building. 40 minutes. In a room that only 7 wolves had authorized access to. The same room where Caiden's seal had been used. The room went very quiet. The prosecutor began to object. The Alpha King looked at him. "You may sit," the king said. It was not a suggestion. The prosecutor sat. The Verity's findings were then presented to the court. The file metadata, the user account, the physical access logs showing that Drexler's office door had been opened and closed 3 separate times in the hour after Caiden's briefing officially ended. Each piece of information was delivered without raised voices, without drama, without any performance at all. Just facts, placed one after another in a line that could only lead to one conclusion. Commander Drexler Fane was called to stand before the court. He had built his entire career on being unreadable. 20 years of command, of political pressure, of difficult decisions, and through all of it, the same steady face and measured calm. He stood at the front of the room, and he held that face for 40 minutes, while the evidence was laid before him. Then the Alpha King asked him a single question. "When did you first make contact with the Ashcroft representative?" The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room the way water fills a closed space. It pressed into every corner. It lasted long enough that people in the benches began to shift in their seats. Drexler did not answer. In the Alpha King's court, under direct questioning from the Crown, silence was not without consequence. It was, by the law that governed every pack in the kingdom, treated as an admission. Drexler seemed to understand this. Something in his face shifted, not breaking exactly, but settling, like a man who had been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time and had simply, finally, put it down. So, the Alpha King walked to the front of the room. It was the first time he had moved from his seat since the trial began. He did not hurry. He walked the full length of the hall slowly, and the room was so quiet that his footsteps were the only sound. He spoke for 11 minutes. He named the full shape of the conspiracy. He described how classified intelligence had been taken from the war room using a dead man's login, printed in a private office, marked with a stolen seal impression, and delivered into enemy hands by a contact whose messages had been found in an encrypted folder that the Verity had recovered from the same workstation. He named Drexler Fane as the one who organized it. He named the 4 young soldiers as people who had been threatened into participation. He named the motive clearly, an old wound of jealousy, a promotion given to Caiden over Drexler nearly 5 years earlier, and a long-running arrangement with the rival pack that exchanged information for political promises. He named the 12 wolves who had died, not as victims of a traitor within their own ranks, but as victims of one man's ambition. He said their names aloud, one by one, and let each name rest in the air for a moment before moving to the next. When he finished, he turned and looked directly at Caiden. Caiden had not moved from his seat. He sat straight, his hands resting on his knees, his face exactly as it had been throughout the entire trial. Still, attentive. Without the kind of desperate hope that breaks a person when it goes wrong. "Caiden Voss," the king said. His voice was not warm. It was something more reliable than warm. It was certain. "You were asked to stand before your pack, your mate, and this court, accused of the worst thing a soldier can do. You were given no protection and no visible ally. You held your position without breaking, without begging, and without lying to make things easier for yourself." He paused. "You held," he said simply. "That matters." Caiden looked at the king. Something moved through his chest. Not relief exactly, not yet. More like the first full breath after a very long time underwater. He nodded once. "And Drexler Fane was taken into custody before the day was over." The 4 young soldiers made formal statements, their voices still unsteady. 2 of them wept. No one stopped them. The prosecutor who had built his case on false evidence was removed from his position, quietly and without ceremony. Bryn Solis was reinstated to her rank that same afternoon. The formal offer included a note of promotion, a recognition that what she had done required a specific kind of strength the Crown did not take lightly. She declined it. She said she would rather return to the unit she came from, where she knew the people and the work. The Alpha King approved the request without comment. Caiden received his formal letter of exoneration just before the King's party left Pack territory. It was delivered by one of the Verity, a quiet woman with careful eyes, and it was written in the formal language of the crown, with the royal seal pressed into dark wax at the bottom. It was not an apology. Kings did not issue apologies. It was something more precise, a restoration of name, rank, and standing, and a formal declaration that the record showed no fault and no guilt. He held it in both hands for a moment, then he folded it and placed it in his coat. Celine found him in the small anteroom off the main hall, just as the last of the official proceedings were wrapping up. He was standing by the narrow window, looking at nothing in particular, when he heard her footsteps and turned. She looked tired, not the tired of someone who had been through a difficult week. The tired of someone who had done something they could not undo, and had been living with that knowledge every hour since. She stopped a few feet away. She did not reach for him. She did not try to explain herself in a way that might have been easier for her, but less honest. "I made the wrong choice," she said. "I knew, somewhere inside, that something about all of this was not right. But my family was frightened, and the evidence looked certain, and I chose what felt safe. For me." She stopped. "That is the truth of it. I am not asking you to forgive me. I am asking you to know that I understand what I did." Caiden looked at her for a long time. He thought about the morning they had taken him away, and the way her eyes had moved from his face. He thought about the document she had filed, still folded in the pocket over his heart. He reached into his coat and placed the folded severance petition on the narrow table between them. He did not tear it. He did not hand it back to her. He set it down and removed his hand. "I need time," he said. "That is all I know right now. I need time." She looked at the document for a moment. Then she looked back at him and nodded. She picked the paper up. She left the room. He did not know what she would do with it. He did not know what he wanted her to do with it. That was the honest answer, and he had promised himself through all of this that he would deal only in honest answers from here on. In a cranks. The next morning he rose before the sun, as he always had, and walked to the edge of the territory where the tree line thinned and the open field beyond could be seen clearly. The grass was silver with early frost. The sky held that particular shade of dark blue that comes just before the light actually arrives. He stood there for a while and simply breathed. He heard footsteps behind him, and knew without turning that it was Bryn. She came to stand beside him with her hands in her coat pockets, and looked out at the same field without saying anything. That was one of the things he had always valued about her. She understood that some moments do not need to be filled with words. After a while, she said, "What now?" He thought about it. His name had been cleared. His rank was restored. The men who had framed him were being held to account. The truth had come out, not because he had been lucky, but because one soldier had refused to lie, and one king had refused to look away. He was standing on the same ground he had always stood on. It looked different now, not because it had changed, but because he had seen what it was made of. He had seen what he was made of too. "I do not know," he said, "but I am still here." Bryn nodded, as if that were a complete and reasonable answer. Maybe it was. The light came slowly, the way it always does. Not all at once, but in small increases, each one barely noticeable, until, without knowing quite when it happened, you realized that you could see clearly again. Caiden stood in it. He let it reach him. He was still here. And for now, that was enough.